Well, in this portion of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, verses 1 to 12, you can see that we are dealing with the subject of marriage and divorce. And this is, of course, a very delicate subject for many. But we have to keep in mind, when we read passages like this, in fact, when we read the whole Bible, we have to keep in mind that the Bible tells us two things. It tells us how things should be, but it also deals with the way things actually are. If we don't remember that, then we end up with a very lopsided view of life. Now, most of us, not all of us, but most of us are married, and many of us have been touched perhaps directly by divorce, and more of us, of course, have been touched indirectly by it. The UK government, and indeed our own local government, have grappled with these subjects in recent years, and in recent decades for that matter. But for many, many generations, the view of the state and the view of the church in these matters was pretty much the same. They were pretty much going along the same lines. All but the youngest of us really grew up in a society where that was the case. But the thing is that the world and the church are at odds. That is the truth. That is the reality. Remember Romans 12, verse 2, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Transformed, not conformed, as the motto of this church is. Well, over the last 50 plus years, the world has been very much diverging from its previous path in this area. So there is now an increasingly large difference between the state and the church on these subjects. We are easily conditioned by the world around us, but that should not be. Of course, we see large swathes of the professing church sort of falling over themselves to be as much like the world as they possibly can be. When the world changes, they want to change with them. But of course, that's not what the Bible and God, therefore, expects of us. The Guernsey marriage law was changed in 2020, so just a few years back. There was a number of changes in that, but the big one, I suppose, was that it allowed people of the same sex to marry each other. And of course, that followed what was going on in the UK. In the UK, the law around divorce has been changed so that it's now much easier to divorce. Now, it only requires the two parties to agree that that's what they want. A quickie divorce, as it's now generally known. So what you see then is that in the eyes of the state, marriage is simply just some kind of social construct that's been created and just accepted by society. But here, Jesus, among other things, shows us that it was God who instituted marriage, and that therefore man has no right to mess with it. Now, while the Bible does teach on this subject, it's fair to say that even among very sound and solid Christian pastors, etc., there are some differences of opinion. But I will do my best to stick to what the Bible actually says on the matter. Well, that was a bit of a long intro, but as I said, this is one of a number of areas where we see the society in which we are placed at great odds with the Bible. And therefore we do have to pay particular attention to what the Word of God says to us, so that we may be transformed and not conformed. Well then, the background to this is that Jesus, he's left Galilee and he's gone down south to Judea. And the words beyond Jordan just means he's gone to the other side, the east side of the river. And as usual, large crowds then, they followed him, they gathered round him, and those that needed healing, he healed. But then, as so often happened, a group of Pharisees came along, and they really only have one thing in mind. They want to disrupt Jesus' ministry. They want to show that he is opposed to Moses and therefore a charlatan. He's not worthy to be listened to. And as we saw when we read that passage together, they pick on the subject of divorce. Now, why they picked on that particular subject, I can't be sure, but maybe you recall that when Jesus spoke on the subject in the Sermon on the Mount, and we looked at that sometime early last year, in Matthew 5:31, he said, "It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement." And then he went on to say, "But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced, committeth adultery." Now it's those words, "it hath been said," that stand out really in the light of today's reading. Because it looks like it wasn't that uncommon for men to divorce their wives so long as they wrote out this letter of divorcement. And the way that the Pharisees word their question here in verse 3, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Well, this suggests that they were familiar with Jesus' views on the subject and purposely worded the question as broadly as possible, so quite contrary to what Jesus was speaking in the Sermon on the Mount. And we can discover about this subject from those times that there's plenty of indication that men were divorcing their wives for the most frivolous of reasons. Anyway, that is the question they pose. And we're clearly told that they posed it tempting Jesus, tempting him. They clearly didn't have a good end in view. They weren't really interested in the subject. They were, as we would say, up to no good. That was what they were doing. And yet despite their evil intentions, God has brought good out of this, because we now have a much clearer picture of the commitment that marriage entails. Now, we know how they react if Jesus answered in the negative, as he in fact did, but it wouldn't have been beyond them to suggest that if Jesus had answered positively, saying, "Yeah, of course you can do that," then they would have said, "Well, he's merely pandering to the lusts of men." We know those that didn't like Jesus did their level best to trap him in his words. But as we would expect, Jesus was far too smart for them. So in answer to this question that they've posed, he doesn't just give a yes or no answer. He says, this is verses 4 and 6, let me just read them again, verses 4 to 6. "Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and they shall cleave to his wife, and they twain," that is those two, "shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." So you see what he's done there? He's taken them not back to Moses as such, but right back to the beginning of creation, to show them that it was God that instituted marriage, not man. And as God has done that, he's done that, so man shouldn't think that it's within his power to break it up. And that was his answer in a nutshell. But we should look at it at what he says in more detail to really appreciate marriage. Jesus says that God made man male and female. Well, that would be a bit controversial in some circles these days, but there it is. There it is. And of course, the reality is, isn't it, that no matter what people may think, simple biology shows us that there are only male and female human beings. And it's for this reason, or cause as our translation has it, that a man leaves the family home and starts a new family. And he doesn't just start a new family, he cleaves to his wife, as it says here. Very many creatures were created male and female, not just humans. But we are told here that the reason humans were created male and female was so that they would marry. And then the word cleave in "and shall cleave to his wife," well, that's a very strong word. It means something like being glued together. In other words, the husband, he has no desire for anyone else. He wants only her. He wants only his wife. And of course, that is among the reasons that it is very sad when we see a husband not behaving like that. Sometimes he either treats his wife as if she didn't exist, or he treats her downright badly. Our thoughts are drawn, are they not, to Ephesians 5:25 that tells us, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." Even as Christ loved the church. How much did Christ love the church? He loved the church enough to suffer and die for it. That's how much he loved the church. And so, if a man doesn't believe he can give that kind of commitment to a woman, then he shouldn't be thinking of marrying her. And then we're told that they two, twain is the old word for two, those two shall be one flesh. And of course, they remain two individuals. They go about different daily tasks, perhaps. But there is, or there should be, a oneness displayed in their relationship. In a good marriage, the harmony and accord will be evident for all to see. They no longer think just of themselves, but they think and work together. Now you might say, well, I know plenty of marriages that aren't like that, and I will say a little on that in a moment. But before I do so, there is that concluding statement where Jesus says, "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder," let him not break up. The very fact, then, that God has instituted marriage in the first place should be enough for us not to treat it lightly. But it also tells us that it was indeed God who created marriage for us, so it must be a good thing. Today, many have looked upon marriage disdainfully. They've probably done that, some people, through all the ages. And today, what passes for marriage is nothing like what God instituted. And I suspect there may well be a few of you thinking, well, if marriage is a good thing, why do so many go sour? And that is a fair question. But the answer is easy. The world, and mankind in particular, are not the same as they were in the beginning. Sin has ruined everything. Rebelling against God has its consequences. And sadly, that means, among many other things, that we no longer treat one another the way that we should. And sometimes, of course, that's to devastating effect. War, I suppose, is the ultimate display of that failure, but it's on display in our individual relationships, and many, it can be seen by many too. And of course that is so universally true that even in the New Testament, Christian husbands and Christian wives have to be told how to behave towards each other. You can see there, it's indicative that it's not something that any longer comes naturally to us. We still have to be told how we should behave. But when both the husband and wife obey those directives, then their marriage does show something of the beauty that was originally intended. But they do have to expend energy on doing this. Like I say, it doesn't just fall into our laps, as it were. Well, Jesus then, having said, what therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder, saying that, he's effectively confirming that it is not lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause. And so these Pharisees, in effect, they say, aha, he doesn't believe or uphold what Moses said. Now, of course, they weren't quite that blatant, were they? They ask, in response, well, why? Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and put her away? They're referring to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 and 2. And there it says, when a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favour in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Now, the first thing we can see there is that Moses did not command that they should be divorced. He only allowed it. And it is as plain as day that it wasn't for every or any cause. It says, if he hath found some uncleanness in her, and the word translated uncleanness in the Hebrew has more to do with nakedness than anything else. So it's evident that this is something to do with sexual immorality of some kind. And that's why when Jesus responds to them, he says, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Fornication, as you know, I believe, is a broad word that covers all and every kind of sexual immorality. And Jesus is here saying, well, that's the only ground for divorce. So far from this broad scope you've presented before me, no, it's a much more limited scope. Now, we do discover elsewhere that there is at least one other ground for divorce. But here what Jesus is doing is using Moses' words to refute those who claim to hold wholeheartedly to what Moses said. He's telling them that if they so willingly play the Moses card, so to speak, thinking that they can ditch their wives for frivolous reasons, well, if that's what they're doing so that they can move on and marry someone else, well, all they are actually doing is committing adultery. But of course, it shouldn't surprise us that fornication is a ground for divorce. The amount of betrayal that is involved when a man or a woman is unfaithful to their spouse is simply enormous. It's off the scale, as we say. Among other things, marriage entails a great deal of trust. Trust is vitally important in a marriage. When that is broken, everything else sort of collapses around it like a house of cards. Now, but it is possible that the two might make reconciliation. And if they can, that's to be applauded. However, given that it is God and not just Moses that allowed for divorce in these circumstances, circumstances, we can't simply assume, much less require, that a husband and wife in that situation must be reconciled. Of course, grace can achieve much, but we cannot lose sight of the reality that this is a fallen world and our hearts have become hardened against God and thereby hardened against each other. Now, having said that we discover there is at least one other ground for divorce elsewhere, it's only fair that I make mention of that. It's in 1 Corinthians 7, and the Apostle Paul, he speaks about the situation where a believing man or woman is married to somebody who's not a believer. And he says that divorcing a spouse just because they're an unbeliever is not acceptable. It's not allowable. You can't do it. But in verse 15 of that chapter, he says, "But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases." They're not bound to each other that way. Now, this has become known as what we call willful desertion. Willful desertion. Now, that's easy to understand in its most basic form. An unbelieving person doesn't like living and being married to a person that loves the Lord Jesus and who seeks to live in accordance with the 10 Commandments. And so they just up and leave. In those circumstances, the one who has left is as if they were dead as far as the marriage contract is concerned. But life in this fallen world is rarely as simple as that. What do you do when a husband, say, it can be the wife, but I tend to lay a heavier weight of responsibility on the man, but what do you do when a husband is a wife beater, or something like that, for example? Forcing the wife to stay in that situation is simply putting her in danger. And that would be contrary to the 6th commandment. So they would have to be separated, or at least they ought to be. And of course the sad thing is that many in that situation, they soldier on. They have no one to turn to. They're trapped, as they would describe it. They just stay put. Now, the ideal would be for them to talk to their pastor. He should be able to help determine if a crime has been committed and help pursue the correct course of action. But even if there's no crime committed, but there is still clearly a need for the two of them to be apart for a while, well, he may be able to facilitate that. But either of those sort of situations, whether it involves a crime or not, but you can clearly see that they need to be apart at least for a while, either of those kind of situations lead or lend themselves to the separation being of actually quite long duration. If you just use that example of a wife beater, for example. Very often, people like that, even if they're not explicitly that, but people like that very often do not face up to what they are like. They think that somehow they're the offended party. They simply will not recognise that they can possibly be in the wrong. Now, in those kind of situations, you cannot realistically expect somebody to go back to a situation, to a person like that, you see. And then, of course, a point must be reached when the separation has been so long that it's in effect desertion by virtue of the length of time. Now, perhaps you might say, well, what about if this person in error is a Christian? What happens then? But in reality, there's no other circumstance in which you would believe that such a persistent offender was truly a Christian. You wouldn't. You'd never believe it. Like I say, life is rarely simple, but we can still work out what biblical principles apply and then apply them. And then, before moving on, I really should also say that I know that some people don't feel comfortable talking to their pastor in such circumstances. That's a reality. That's the way it is. We might say, well, it reflects a failure within a church to be a family, but say what you like, that still is the case. What we have to remember is that people in distressed marriages, as in any distressed situation, need help and support. And those that can help, whether it's the pastor or somebody else, whoever they are, they ought to and should be quick to help. Now, interestingly, even Jesus' disciples think that what Jesus has said is rather on the strict side. They say in verse 10, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. When you pause and think about that, what they've just said, it gives you some idea as to how widespread that notion of, dispensing with your wife for any reason had become. But Jesus here, he picks up on what they say about not marrying, and he tells them, well, all men cannot receive this saying, save to them to whom it is given. Not everyone can abstain from marriage. We can't forget that when God instituted marriage, in the beginning, he said, this is Genesis 2:18, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him. Meet simply means suitable. Marriage, then, we see, is the natural and desirable relationship for people, for humans. God himself says so. I have little doubt that the underlying reason that biblical marriage is so often under attack is because it is a God-given institution. And the Bible regularly reminds us that by nature we are at war with God. And so given that God shows us it is the expected relationship for us to be in, we can also say that anyone that seeks to enforce celibacy, thinking there is some advantage to be gained in God's sight, well, that they are sadly mistaken. Jesus affirmed, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. Chastity is not something that is ours by nature. He says it's a gift. It's a matter of grace. And then Jesus refers to those who have received this gift of not marrying as eunuchs. Now, strictly speaking, a eunuch is a man that's been castrated. And one group of such men he describes as those which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Now, to actually emasculate yourself in this way, that also would be a violation of the sixth commandment. So it cannot be done for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So Jesus is plainly using the word metaphorically to cover all those who do not, and perhaps cannot, marry. Now, that is consistent with the style of Jesus' teaching. He often uses that dramatic overstatement in the things that he says. Some people, he says, are born that eventually have no inclination to marry. Others, he says, have suffered violence at the hands of men, which renders them unable to enter into marriage. Now, we might think that neither of those two groups could look on their condition as a gift, especially those that have experienced some kind of violence. But remember, this is dramatic overstatement. We are only talking about those who willingly abstain from marriage as a result of what they've been through. And then the third group are those who cheerfully remain single for the purpose of serving in the advancement of the kingdom of heaven. Paul also alludes to them in 1 Corinthians 7. In that chapter, he extols the virtues of marriage, but he tells his readers that there are some circumstances where not having a husband or wife, somebody that you have to consider as well as yourself, well, that allows a greater use of their time in service. Now, just in case anyone is thinking that contradicts what I just said about those being in error that enforce celibacy, thinking there's something to be gained in God's sight by doing so, well, if you think again, because this is only about voluntary actions, not enforced actions. Marriage is good. It is honourable in all, it says in Hebrews 13 and verse 4. But, of course, just as sin has ruined everything, so, of course, its long shadow has been cast over this institution. And so, as we draw toward a close, what can we say? Well, we can say that our love for our spouse must spur us on in self-sacrifice. We can say that there must be genuine trust in each other, a trust which must not be broken. But we remember, because sin has made us hard-hearted, even something as wonderful as marriage can still collapse. And there can be genuine, I'm not saying particularly good, but genuine reasons for that collapse. But frivolous reasons have to be excluded. Husbands, rather than seeking any frivolous reason to divorce their wife, should rather love her as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. As our opening truth that makes us sing reminded us, we are to keep even unchaste thoughts far from us.